So we are going to get started because we have a very special guest here today from Bethel University who's going to be talking to us about financial aid. So I do, like I said, just want to go ahead and get started. So my name is Kat. Thank you for joining me. I'm so glad that all of you are here. Today we're going to be talking about financial aid, specifically what happens after you apply for financial aid. Okay, so like I said, this is me. I'm also joined today by Beth Barsness from the Minnesota Department of Education. We are the co-chairs to Minnesota Goes to College. And I'm sure that all of you are sick of hearing about this, but just so that you know it and can repeat it if asked about it, we are Minnesota Goes to College, and that is comprised of 3 different initiatives. The first is College Knowledge Month. So that's when a lot of colleges in the state waive application fees. And it's, like I said, done in October. The second is done October through February usually, and is FAFSA and DREAM Act events, so financial aid events, helping our students complete and apply, answering any questions. And then finally, there is Decision Day, which is celebrated in May, is sort of co-opted from College Signing Day, or when athletes are signed on to a college sports team. We co-opted it into the post-secondary education realm. And that's really to celebrate students' decision, wherever it is they're going after high school. It could be the workforce, it could be military, or it could be college. So we want to make sure that we celebrate their decisions on Decision Day. So that is who we are, those 3 separate initiatives. Moving swiftly on. We have these spring webinars. So this actually started last semester. I'm in school right now, so I'm thinking in semesters, but in the fall, essentially. And we are really hoping to talk to you all, right? The counselors, the college access staff, anyone who's working with students who are in high school or middle school, working towards getting college knowledge and just understanding what they can do with their futures based on education. And so this is a different format from the fall. We are now doing bi-weekly instead of weekly. You do need to register for each session, which is different than last semester. And something that we heard with our survey is that you really want more opportunities for idea sharing. And so we are making sure to incorporate that more into these webinars. And so a last note is that this is different from something that my office does that I'm actually involved with also, so it is a little confusing. But the site coordinator webinars, these spring webinars, are different than the Minnesota Office of Higher Education public engagement calls. We have similar topics, but they're slightly different audiences. The public engagement calls is more for everyone, and our upcoming topic is about student housing and food insecurity on the 24th. So, but I'm not supposed to be advertising for that. I'm supposed to be telling you about Minnesota Goes to College. And so the next webinar that we have is on March 2nd at 2:30. And, speaking of idea sharing, this is really what we're hoping for this next March 2nd, Tuesday, March 2nd at 2:30 is really what we'd like it to be about. And so it's going to be we're thinking about sharing interactive virtual tools and resources, spring application efforts, and then again, focusing on Decision Day. So I know Beth wanted me to ask you to put in the chat if you could ask another site coordinator across the state one question about their campaign or their program, what would it be? So again, if you could ask a site coordinator another question to help you and your students be successful, what would it be? And go ahead and put that in the chat.
And this is Beth. I'm just unmuting myself briefly. There are a couple of people who are in here who I cannot promote to panelists, just won't let me. So you don't show up in the panelist list. Everyone else would be able to raise their hand, unmute themselves to ask a question. And you should be able to chat to everyone. So for the Angela and Jesse who are unable to be promoted, you can just chat directly to me if you have a question, and I will make sure that our presenters know your question. Sorry about that.
Okay, so perhaps people are still thinking about it, still percolating what they might want to ask other people. If it occurs to you at some point during the presentation, go ahead and pop it in the chat. But for the sake of time, I will be moving on. So again, last reminder, it's not next week, but the week after, March 2nd, and it's going to be idea sharing with other site coordinators. So please come, we hope to see you there. And then without further ado, we have the lovely Jeff Olson, Financial Aid Director at Bethel University here today to talk to us about what happens after the FAFSA. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oops, don't mean to give his stuff away. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then he's going to take it over. So 1 second.
So Beth or Kat, I'm not, oh, there's the share button. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. It's been kind of fun watching names of people show up that I recognize. There's some dear friends in the group today, so thank you so much for being here. I am Jeff. I work at the Financial Aid Office at Bethel University. This particular slide, a little bit about my background, big picture. My family has been involved in a lot of different kinds of colleges, universities. You can see some of the schools represented there that our family has gone to. I started in financial aid in '94. I feel like I know a little bit about financial aid, but I still, every day I've got questions about financial aid and things continue to change. The presentation we're going to focus on today will begin by reviewing a little bit about why complete the free application for federal student aid. Then we'll focus more on filing the FAFSA, what happens after that. We've got some sample financial aid offers or award letters. The U.S. Department of Education is trying to encourage us all to use the phrase financial aid offer instead of financial aid award letter. I may slip up and call it an award letter from time to time, but the focus, when we talk about a financial aid offer, that's what we've always in the past called an award letter. And then we'll talk about some other options, additional information. And again, if you have questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and put those in the chat. As we transition between these different sections, I'll pause and we'll see if there's any questions. And if not, we'll keep on going and we'll see if this can be helpful for you all. Well, in terms of review, why complete the free application for federal student aid? A lot of times we'll hear from students who want to know about their FAFSA money. Well, there isn't any FAFSA money, but the free application for federal student aid is used to determine eligibility for need-based government grants, also for non-need-based loans. So even if there's a student or a parent who's saying, I want my students to have a little skin in the game and they want to be considered for a direct student loan, they would need to complete the free application for federal student aid for that purpose. Much of the information when you go through and apply for FAFSA focuses on federal financial aid. And so it's really important as we get into the different kinds of financial aid and understanding the messaging is a little limited because it focuses on federal financial aid. When we ask the question about the different kinds of financial aid and the best kind are grants and scholarships, and where that money comes from. This is an illustration from the state of Minnesota for students at undergraduate institutions. In 2017-18, there was about $1.5 billion in grants and scholarships that went to students in those undergraduate programs. A little over half of it came from the colleges and universities. About 23% came from the federal government, and most of that was in the form of the federal Pell Grant. And as you know, the way you apply for the Pell Grant is you complete the free application for federal student aid. And 13% came from the state of Minnesota, most of that in the form of the Minnesota State Grant. And the way that you apply for the Minnesota State Grant is by completing the FAFSA. So my encouragement to students is, if you're looking for the best kind of gift aid, make sure you check out the college or university, but also fill out the free application for federal student aid. And by doing that, you've covered 95% of the sources of the grants and scholarships. Now, there's different kinds of colleges and universities. Again, this is just a review. The typical average tuition and fees in 17-18 for the not-for-profit institutions in Minnesota was much higher than some of the other sectors. But focus on the red line in this particular graph or chart. This shows you the percent of undergraduate students that were receiving institutional gift aid, grants or scholarships funded by the college or university. And while those grants or scholarships may be more common at a not-for-profit school like a St. Thomas or a Hamlin, the chart shows that all of the different colleges and universities, on average, they offer some amount of institutional grant or scholarship. So it's really important for students to fill out the free application for federal student aid and then ask at the college or university what types of institutional grants or scholarships might be available there at the school. Any questions about that brief review of doing the FAFSA? Well, let's move on then to the second phase. And this is assuming the student has already filled out the FAFSA, what comes next after completing the FAFSA? And one of the things that's really important for students to think about is asking the question, does the FAFSA accurately tell their story? Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they may have made a mistake on the FAFSA, a correction isn't necessary. We'll talk a little bit about making corrections, the verification process, appeals. We'll talk briefly about what happens behind the scenes in processing the FAFSA, and then encouraging students again to be on the lookout for financial aid offers. The government tells us that roughly 30% of students are flagged for a process called verification. That ratio it varies widely depending on the college or university. And what we've seen at Bethel University is the number of students selected for verification is going down. Yet some of my peers, maybe at a community college, they're saying, no, the number is still pretty high. If a student is selected for verification, that doesn't mean they've done anything wrong at all. It's not an indication they've done something wrong. It's just a requirement for the college or university to verify that the information on the FAFSA is accurate. There used to be a standard verification worksheet that all colleges made available to incoming students or students selected for verification. The verification requirements are now customized depending on how the students answered the questions. So frequently, students may have some type of a custom form they have to complete for the college or university. The school will send that information to the students. If the students are applying for financial aid at more than one school, they're selected for verification at all of those schools when the feds select them for the verification process. And the students will have to submit that verification process to each of the colleges or universities that they're applying to. The kind of information that the students need to submit as part of satisfying verification will vary depending on whether or not they filed a tax return or whether their parent filed a tax return or if the student did not file a tax return. So even students who did not file a tax return can be selected for verification, and they may have to, for example, document how much income they earned from work or document the family size or the number in college. Again, sometimes there's a little confusion on where do they send the information for verification. They send it to the college or university, and that school will provide instructions on how to get the documentation submitted. It's pretty common that students and families want to submit their verification documentation electronically. We highly recommend that students do not email confidential forms like their tax returns. But many schools will have a process where they can upload documents securely right into the school's portal. So either mail the documentation or follow the school's instructions on how to upload that data in a secure manner. Some schools or some students, when they complete the FAFSA is accurate. They may even have been verified, but the FAFSA does not necessarily portray their family's current situation. Because the family, when answering the questions on the FAFSA, they were asked about income from 2 years ago. And maybe now the income is significantly reduced, perhaps due to COVID or some other reason. So the student has the opportunity at each of the colleges and universities to go through a process. Sometimes it's called special circumstances, sometimes it's called professional judgment, but they can document why their income might be significantly less than what was on the FAFSA and see if that adjusts the eligibility for financial aid. Now, if a student has submitted their FAFSA and the results come back and show that the family contribution is zero, there's probably not much of need to go through an appeal process because that student's already eligible for the maximum amount of need-based gift aid. Or at the other extreme, if the student's contribution is in the hundreds of thousands, the family, if their parents' income even was cut in half, maybe instead of a $200,000 expected family contribution, it's $100,000. It's still so large it may not impact eligibility for need-based aid. But still, it's a fair question. It's an appropriate question to ask at the college university to see is there a way to make the FAFSA more realistic. The assumption basically is income from the family is pretty stable from one year to the next. And so when income goes down during the year when the student's going to be in college, that's when it's important, at least on a reduced income type of an appeal, to reach out to the college or university and see what we can do differently. Behind the scenes, when students submit their free application for federal student aid, there are a number of database matches that occur. For example, we're looking to see if we can get confirmation of student citizenship, or is the male student registered for selective service. If the student is not a U.S. citizen, can we document that, yes, this is an eligible non-citizen? In terms of loan default or unusual enrollment history is trying to identify somebody who's jumping from school 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and they're really not staying enrolled. They're just going through the financial aid process to try to get a Pell Grant credit quickly in their pocket and then move on to the next school without even attending college. So those things are happening behind the scenes. And if there is an issue in processing the FAFSA, there'll be notation on the student aid report, but the college or university will also reach out to the student and say, we've got a question. Maybe the student wasn't selected for verification, but the college or university will coach the student how to get those issues resolved. Sometimes the FAFSA is rejected. A real common reason that the FAFSA would be rejected has to do with getting the signature from the student and the parent. So if there's a delay in getting the signature through the system, sometimes that will cause a problem. Sometimes it's an issue because there's an error or cannot confirm citizenship with the Social Security Administration. And again, the student will receive communication back from the U.S. Department of Education saying we had a problem with your FAFSA, and here are the steps you need to complete in order to get that issue resolved. If the FAFSA goes on to the college or university, the school will typically also reach out to the student to say, here's an issue with your FAFSA, and here are steps that need to be taken in order to resolve it. Sometimes with the rejected FAFSA, there's not a lot that the college or university can do because the student is going to have to make some type of a correction to the FAFSA. But the school can at least, at a minimum, can provide some moral support to say, here are the steps you need to go through in order to get this resolved. Any questions about the processing of the FAFSA, the verification process, or special circumstances?
Yeah, we had one question come in. Could you comment on FAFSA deadline dates and school financial aid priority deadline dates?
I will. In fact, we've got a couple slides on that in just a moment, talking about the FAFSA deadline dates. I don't think I put that slide in, but the FAFSA deadline for the 2020 to 21 school year is June 30 of 2021. That's the latest you can fill out the free application for federal student aid. So it's at the tail end of the academic year. And that helps the student who might be starting in summer school still be able to complete the FAFSA for that summer. But there are other deadlines that are come into effect that FAFSA data contributes towards some type of aid. So for example, the state of Minnesota, the deadline to apply for the Minnesota State Grant is 30 days after the beginning of the term. And the way you apply for that is by completing the FAFSA. So if the fall semester begins on September 1st, the student will need to have completed the FAFSA no later than September 30 to be considered for Minnesota State Grant for that fall term. Individual colleges or universities may have different deadlines that are linked to filing the FAFSA or some other type of application process at the school. But then the key for the latest you can complete the FAFSA is June 30 at the end of the academic year. And sometimes that throws students off because they're doing their FAFSA June 29 of 2020, and they see that June 30 deadline, but for the 2021 school year, that's still a year away, the deadline to fill out the FAFSA. Well, let's move on to talking about some of the terms or definitions that students are going to encounter in their financial aid offer or the award letter. There are different kinds of financial aid, and again, I come back to this frequently, but when I say financial aid, many times when I'm talking with a parent or a student, they hear grant or they hear scholarship, and the mom will be in my office and she'll say something like, my daughter isn't interested in financial aid, she just has a scholarship. Well, from the financial aid office, a grant or a scholarship are simply types of financial aid. And so when we talk about financial aid eligibility, we're including in that the best kinds, that gift aid, the grant or scholarship. A grant frequently has some type of a need component, not always. Sometimes you may need to do the FAFSA in order to be qualified for a grant. Sometimes there may be some other criteria. Scholarships oftentimes have some type of merit or circumstance associated with them. Frequently, there may be some condition. You need to be full-time, for example, in order to receive a certain amount of the grant or scholarship. Loans are a type of financial aid. So when we talk about financial aid eligibility, loans are included in that. Some schools will talk about other assistance or resources, and frequently what falls into that category would be the Dollars for Scholars types of scholarships available through the local community. Student employment or work study would be another type of financial aid. And then there's also coming into play income share agreements. And many college financial aid offices, we struggle to know what to do with the income share agreements. They don't fall into any of these other categories, and I'm not even 100% sure they're financial aid, but the information comes through the financial aid office. And so I've added that to this as another type of financial aid. When asking questions at the U.S. Department of Education Federal Student Aid Conference, what guidance do you have about income share agreements? Right now, there's not a lot of consistent guidance. So a student who has an income share agreement, which basically is a promise to say, I will have my charges reduced on the promise that I'll pay back a certain percent of my earnings after I finish college. That's the idea of the income share agreement. And we're beginning to see some students receive these through the local community. In particular, I've seen some come through, I think it's some connection with Urban Venture. Not that Urban Venture is sponsoring the income share agreement, but students who are involved in programs affiliated with Urban Venture seem to be connected with some income share agreements. Other terms or definitions that it's really important that the student pauses to understand: the concept of the cost of attendance. And cost of attendance, the next slide will go into more details of that, but cost of attendance is a term frequently used by the financial aid office, and oftentimes it's a sum that is larger than what the family will have to pay, but we often use it in the financial aid office to try to get an idea of what your bill will be. Some schools will talk about direct costs, the charges that the school is going to charge directly to you, or indirect costs. And we've got a couple slides that go into more detail on that in a moment. It's also really important to understand the assumptions that the school is making. Are you going to be full-time? Are you going to be living on campus? Are you going to be living at home? It's also important to understand this idea of total, or what's the total charges, or what's the total amount you're going to pay per term. And in a few minutes, we'll look at sample financial aid award letters or financial aid offers, and we'll see how schools talk about the total charges differently. We don't always use the same math in what's included in the cost and what's included in the gift aid to come up with that amount that the student's going to have to pay out of pocket. And so that's where it really puts the onus on the student to understand how to interpret the financial aid offer, especially offer 1 compared to offer 2 or 3, and be able to understand the differences between what is a grant or a scholarship. Is the loan being included in calculating the out-of-pocket or not? And we'll see in the financial aid offers how schools do that differently. Well, what's the difference between the cost of attendance in that idea of the direct cost or the indirect costs? What you see on the screen here, these are the components of cost of attendance that all colleges are required to include. The tuition and fees, which is always paid directly to the school, an allowance for books and supplies or transportation or miscellaneous personal expenses, room and board, which sometimes is paid directly to the school and sometimes is not. There's a room and board component in the cost of attendance, even for students if they're living at home. And so it's really important in trying to understand what do I need to pay to the school or what other resources are available to help me pay some of my living expenses if I'm living off campus. It's important that students take time to unpack the financial aid award letter. Now this slide gives a ballpark idea in 2019-20 what different types of schools charge or included in their cost of attendance. And you can see the dark blue information along the bottom. That's the allowance for the room and board. Not a lot of variance depending on the different schools, even if you're looking at off-campus or on-campus. The average for the private for-profit school where students are living off-campus, that average cost of attendance component for room and board was about $9,300. Very similar to the cost of attendance component at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities or private nonprofits and other campuses. In the middle, you see the dollar amount for the books and supplies or other expenses, and a significant amount of variance in that amount from one sector to the other, and then huge changes in the amount of tuition that's being charged, tuition and fees. Another issue that comes up is that idea of, is this a financial aid estimate or is this a financial aid offer? Sometimes the estimates are really, really, really close, but it's important for the student to understand, is this an estimate or is it an offer? Sometimes schools will send out information about a merit scholarship notification, and that might be the entire amount of financial aid available from the school, but the merit scholarship frequently comes from the admissions office, and it may not be the complete financial aid offer. So make sure the students understand, in addition to getting that merit scholarship notification, is there other types of financial aid which could include need-based grants or loan eligibility or work eligibility that would be part of the overall financial aid offer. Many students will look at the net price calculator to get a ballpark idea of the estimate of what their cost is, and it's a great way to get that idea of the estimate, but the net price calculator is not the financial aid offer. So students need to take that other step of actually completing the FAFSA and going through the admissions and the financial aid application process at the school. Schools will send out estimated financial aid offers. Sometimes it's just individual components, like we're estimating the Pell Grant or we're estimating the Minnesota State Grant. And once we've finalized the calculation of those values, we might send out another financial aid offer where they can see there's a little bit of a variance in specific fund codes on the financial aid offer. Other times, the whole thing is estimated and it's just a shot in the dark. So it's really important for the school or for the students to understand, is this actual, is this locked in stone, or does this need to be validated in some way and might change depending on other types of financial aid or other types of resources. What you're seeing on the right-hand side is an example from Bethel University of the terms and conditions. And it's intentionally small print because the colleges or universities will have terms and conditions. And if the students are like me, I don't want to read these terms and conditions. But at least the first time as they're going through the application process as incoming new students, if we can encourage them to pause and to read through the terms and conditions, ask questions about things they don't understand, it's really important that they understand these things. An example that we're looking at here within the Bethel terms and conditions is under what circumstances will we change the amount of financial aid we've offered to the student. And that's a component that's so important for students to understand and not to just say, I've received a financial aid offer, that's my grants and my scholarships, and not stopping to realize, well, maybe the state grant is based on 15 credits and you're taking 12, and you're going to lose some state grant if you're not enrolled in the full 15 credits. This particular slide I use when I talk about net price calculators with families. And I included it here because we've got the variance in the cost of attendance right in the middle, the darker area, and then the gift aid and then the estimated net price. And you'll see this kind of language showing up on financial aid award letters or financial aid offers, where many schools will use this federal definition of estimated net price, and they use that concept on the financial aid award letter or the financial aid offer. They'll say, here's the total cost of attendance, and keep in mind the cost of attendance can include charges that the student is not going to have to pay directly to the college or university. The cost of attendance minus the grants or scholarships equals the estimated net price. What you'll see for other schools on the financial aid award letters is they're not required to use that federal definition of net price on the financial aid award letter or the financial aid offer. And so what you'll see other schools will do is they'll talk about direct costs, and they'll focus on the tuition fees and room and board if this is a student who is living on campus. And they'll talk about the direct cost minus the grants and scholarships is the additional amount of money that you need to pay to cover those direct costs. In some cases, colleges and universities will use the direct costs. They'll subtract the gift aid, and they'll also subtract the types of loans that students can borrow in their own name without a cosigner to come up with that estimated amount. And so it's really, again, it's really, really important that as students receive the financial aid offers, they pause and they say, what's the additional expense that my family's going to have to pay because I'm going to school A or school B? If I'm living on campus, there's additional expense because of the room and board. If I'm living off campus and I have to rent an apartment, that's additional expense, so factor that in. If I'm living at home and I don't have to pay extra to my parents for rent or for food, then they probably want to back out the cost of attendance allowance for room and board and focus more on the tuition and fees and perhaps a book allowance on what we think they might be charged for books. So the things that students need to really watch for on the financial aid offers or award letters, make sure that they can identify what is the direct cost that's owed to the university. It's always going to be the tuition and fee. If it's a residential campus, it would include a room and board amount. The room and board amount on the financial aid offer may not be exactly the same as what the student is charged. I was looking at a financial aid award letter from another school down in Arizona a couple of weeks ago, and I went to their website, and there was a variance of $3,000 or $4,000 in the amount of room and board included on the financial aid award letter compared to what would be the most common housing charge and a more typical meal plan. Some schools will put the lowest possible room rate and the lowest possible meal plan on the financial aid offer letter, and then when students actually apply for housing or they sign up for their meal plan, they realize this meal plan only covers breakfast and lunch, or it doesn't cover all my meals, and so the cost is going to go up. So paying attention not only to is there a dollar amount for food, but also how much food is included when we're looking at meal plan is really important that students understand that. We talked about cost of attendance, we talked about grants and scholarships, but another thing that students will see is often different on the financial aid offers is sometimes the totals are for the year and sometimes the totals are for the term. And so it's important that students identify that variance. The enrollment assumptions, is this being based on full-time or part-time enrollment? And ultimately, what the students are going to want to figure out is how much do they need to pay to the school after subtracting the grants and scholarships, or they pay to the school, and if they're living off campus, how much money are they going to need to pay for their rent and their food and transportation for additional living expenses off campus? Now, one of the questions earlier had to do with FAFSA deadlines. When reaching out to the financial aid offices here in Minnesota each fall in the last few years, I've just reached out and said, hey, if you're talking with a family and they're only applying to your school, when do you encourage them to do the FAFSA? And the consistent message is do your FAFSA in October. Almost all of the colleges, universities are saying to incoming students, in October of your senior year of high school, get your FAFSA done, so that's all taken care of. Well, this year I asked the schools as well, and so here are responses from 54 different colleges in Minnesota. When did the schools begin sending out financial aid offers or financial aid award letters to the incoming students? And this represents when the schools, during what month do they begin sending out those financial aid offers? And you can see one school said October, some are starting in December, January, some aren't beginning to send it out until May or June or later. When we break that down by the type of school, what we notice is it's more common for the 4-year nonprofit schools to send out their financial aid offers early. Now that's because they've got a little bit more control over some of the components that go into calculating the financial aid offer. But the green are the 4-year not-for-profit, the blue are the 4-year public schools. And when we look at the 2-year schools in Minnesota, we can see that the financial aid offers are coming out later. And again, that has to do with the circumstances those schools are facing. They've got to wait for the tuition rates to be set. They're frequently waiting to find out what is the Pell table to be able to go out with financial aid offers. So as students are being encouraged to fill out their FAFSA really early in October, they also need to be prepared to wait for the financial aid offer. And that's where in between there, it often helps to do something like the net price calculator to get a ballpark idea of what the family may need to pay. But the students should not interpret that just because the financial aid offer is coming later, that doesn't mean that the school is not interested and that there aren't resources available. It's important for the students to understand that the different schools they're applying to, when should I expect a financial aid offer from your school, and then hold off on making the decision until they have all of those financial aid offers, so if finances are a big part of their decision. Well, let's take a look at a few financial aid offers. And the first one we're looking at here is from St. Cloud State University, and their student is Blizzard Husky. And we're not going to look at all of the narrative that's here, but I just want to point out a few things. And frankly, in looking at the examples, I began with St. Cloud State because I think they do a really nice job with their financial aid award letter. There's a fair amount of narrative here, but on the left-hand panel, they've got financial aid offers, and they've got it broken down dollar amounts by fall and by spring and by the year. They have grants and scholarships and loans all mixed together in here. Work study eligibility, it's a 1, and a 2, and that basically flags that the student is eligible for work study. They communicate in the narrative here, in addition to this type of grant or scholarship, you may be eligible for up to $4,477 in private educational loans. And they provide some narrative on the right-hand side in talking about those private loans. On the right-hand side, they've tried to break this down a little bit better for the students. And again, they have a column for fall, they've got a column for spring and for the year. You've got the tuition and fees, you've got the housing and meals, and then they're including the books and supplies, and thinking about this as an extra expense that the student is going to incur separate from being in college. And so what they're calling here, they call this total charges. Some schools might call that the direct costs. Then they have a subtotal for the grants and scholarships, Pell Grant, Minnesota State Grant, and other types of scholarships, dollar amounts by term. And then they have total charges minus the total aid that you don't repay. And they're trying to use language that the students are going to understand. Total aid that you don't have to repay are the grants or scholarships. And so they've done the math to say, here's the estimated cost before the loans. So of the tuition fees, room and board, books and supplies, minus the grants and scholarships, here's how much we estimate you're going to have to pay for fall directly to the school, and for spring and for the year. And then they've got aid that you repay, and in parentheses, loans. The subsidized, unsubsidized loan, and in this example, this is a sophomore because the sum of those loans is $6,500. And then there's a remaining balance. So that after you apply for the loans, and if you take out the full loan amount, how much additional you need to come up with to cover your tuition fees, housing, meals, books, and supplies. They've got deadlines in there. They've got information about payment plans. Done a really nice job in breaking down the different components of what goes into the financial aid offer. Here's Bethel University. This is where I work, and here's an example of the financial aid offer, and you're going to see some things that are different. For example, we've got up in the upper left-hand corner, there's the assumptions we're making about how many credits students are taking. We also have an overview, an annual overview of the estimated bill. We call it gift aid instead of the financial aid you don't have to repay. Other assistance, and then the total amount due to Bethel, subtract out the loans, and that the estimated amount due. You also see that in this financial aid offer, we are not breaking it out by fall, spring. This is the annual amount. So the tuition there, the $35,000, that would be the amount for the whole year, not necessarily broken down by fall or by spring. We've broken down the estimated bill, the grants and scholarships, other assistance, and provided a little bit of narrative there, loan options, and we've included the subsidized and unsubsidized. And in this example, this is for a junior or senior, so the $7,500, and then student employment eligibility. We haven't included in our narrative the fact that the student could borrow some additional loan in the form of a parent loan or private loan like St. Cloud did, and we have not broken out the information by fall or spring term. So it's a different view of financial aid eligibility. Here's another school. If we look on the left-hand side, it's an example of a financial aid offer or financial aid award notification. And they've started out by saying here the annual cost of attendance. And so the cost of attendance here is almost $65,000. And they've got subtotals broken down by the tuition and fees, and then calling that the direct costs, and then indirect costs. And in this case, they've included an amount for room and board in the indirect area. Grants and scholarships, they've got that broken down by the term, fall, and spring, and the annual amounts. And then the estimated out-of-pocket costs, and it's important to look at how they're calculating this. In the right-hand side, estimated cost of attendance, so the $64,793 minus the gift aid equals the net cost. So it's a different way of doing the math compared to St. Cloud, compared to Bethel, because they're including in here the miscellaneous and personal. They're including transportation in coming up with a dollar amount. So if this school was comparing school A with St. Cloud and with Bethel, they'd want to unpack that a little bit more to make sure we're comparing apples and apples, not apples and oranges, in what needs to be paid. Here as well, they've put in $36,000 of loans. In order to get to $36,000 of loans, the freshmen can only borrow $5,500 through the direct loan program. So to get up to $36,000, that means there's some type of parent or other person who is either borrowing the loan or at a minimum co-signing the loan to come up with that dollar amount. And then always remember that the work-study eligibility is handled differently than the other grants and scholarships. It's earning potential, so students get paid as they're putting in their hours worked. Down in the lower left-hand corner, they've got the loans and work-study, and they're calling that self-help aid. And this is where they break out saying how much is in the subsidized or unsubsidized loan, and then they're packaging the federal parent loan up to $30,000, and that's how they're coming up with the funds represented at the right. The financial aid offer on the right-hand side, again, they've got cost of attendance, they've got grants and scholarships, they've broken it down by fall and spring, subtotal of grants and scholarships, student loan options, and then your total cost after aid options listed above. And they've done the math for the year, and what they've included the loan amount. Cost of attendance minus all of the grants minus the loans the student can borrow on her own comes up with a dollar amount. And again, you can see how this particular school, they're laying out the information really clearly, but it's when you compare school one with school two in the financial aid offers that you recognize if you're just focusing on the number that's highlighted in blue, well, that's including cost of attendance and it includes loans. It's not direct cost minus gift aid. And so students might come up with a wrong conclusion on which school is more affordable if they're not careful in what's included in the cost and what's included in the type of financial aid that's being factored in. Again, they've packaged the federal direct parent loan and the $7,500. Well, that assumes that a parent is going to apply and that the parent is eligible. Many schools will package a parent loan. Some schools might package private loan. Some schools, like St. Cloud has done, will include information about private or parent loan options and then provide additional information through the website or other materials to help families make the choice. Because frankly, the federal parent loan isn't always the best type of loan. It tends to have higher fees and can have higher interest rates than many of the private loans, especially if the parents have good credit. Here's another example of a financial aid offer, and we won't go spend quite as much time here, but you can see the direct costs at the school broken down by the semester and by the year. And for direct costs, they've included the room and board. They've referenced indirect costs, and that includes the rest of the cost of attendance. Then they've got the grants and scholarships. There's an estimated KC scholars, and so the total cost, estimated cost after grants and scholarships is cost of attendance minus grants and scholarships. They've included work study eligibility and loan eligibility down at the bottom. So they haven't included the loans initially, but they are saying down here, estimated cost of using all aid offered, and it appears to me they're factoring in the work eligibility too, which if they've got total cost of attendance, which includes indirect costs, it sometimes makes sense to include work eligibility. $4,600 work eligibility, the student would also want to look and say, how many hours a week do I need to work in order to earn that $4,600? Here's another example on the right. The school says the cost of attendance is $56,000. So that's just a number. It's not broken down into the different components. How much of that is tuition and fees, or does that what does that actually include? They've got narrative there, but they don't have the dollar amounts for the cost of attendance. They've got their assumptions called out really clearly, and then here's the financial aid award. They've got fall, spring, total, and then an opportunity to accept or checkbox if you want to accept that. But look what they've also done here. This is one of my least favorite examples. They've got the total amount is including the grants and the work and the loans. So the total amount of financial aid for fall is $25,755. And so if students are not being really careful to look at this and say, well, how much of this is a grant or scholarship? Again, keeping in mind for many students, they think of financial aid as being the gift aid, as being the grants and scholarships. So when you see the total, it's really easy to forget to subtract out the work study or subtract out the loan eligibility to understand how much of this is a grant or how much of this is a scholarship. One more slide with sample financial aid offers. And on the left-hand side, we've got Wichita State University. And at the top, they've got the total financial aid offer, $19,295. And then they break it out. And you've got the grants, you've got the loans, you've got the work. So they've got the $19,000 that includes the loans and the work eligibility. Cost of attendance, they've got the estimated billable cost, the tuition and fees, room and boards, and then additional fees that the student's going to have to pay to the school. And then they say the estimated cost after financial aid, they're excluding work study. So they're taking the billable costs minus the loans and the grants to come up with this $7,300. And then they're talking about additional expenses, which is helpful to say, in addition to this, you'll need to cover your transportation, books and supplies and such. And then they talk about payment plans. But again, it's a different way of telling the story. What are your costs? What type of financial aid is available? And then doing the math for the students. It's a different way of doing that compared to some of the other schools. On the right-hand side, you see Johnson Community College. And you look at this, and frankly, a lot more schools are going to this kind of communication, which instead of sending out a paper or electronic letter, it's saying log into the portal. And once you log into the portal, that's when you'll be able to see all the details about the financial aid offer, the cost of attendance, the direct cost, indirect cost, the grant, scholarships, loans, work study eligibility. And so not to be surprised if a student brings a financial aid offer to you and it ends up being something like this, then the student's going to have to log into the school's portal to see the details about the financial aid offer. So when I'm talking with families and I talk with them about how to compare financial aid offers, on the left-hand side, these are things that I strongly encourage them to try to calculate. First off, try to understand what are the direct costs. What is it you're going to have to pay directly to the college or university because you're going to college? Then calculate the grants and scholarships, subtract that from the direct costs, and that's your net direct cost. Now, for the student who might be living off campus, it's appropriate to, in the direct costs, also include extra expense that the family is not paying, would not normally have to pay. So if they're renting an apartment and they need money for food, they should be including that in the total costs, minus the grants and scholarships equals that net direct cost. Books and personal expenses are common. It's really common to see around $1,000 or $1,200 for book expense, regardless of the college that the student is going to be attending. And then other components there, like the travel expense, it's just important to think about what are the extra expenses that we're going to incur because we're going to college. On the right-hand side, although for a net price calculator, the federal government requires us to use total cost of attendance in the calculation of the net cost, I don't think that's as helpful when you're trying to, when you actually have the financial aid offer and you've got the charges, you want to have a sense of what's the extra expense I have to pay to the college or university. Keep in mind there are other expenses, like I may need a new shirt, or I may want to go out for pizza once a week. There may be additional costs, but that tends to be pretty comparable regardless of what school you're going to. And so if you're trying to understand what's the difference in cost between school A and school B, that's focusing on the direct cost is more helpful. And also be really careful about including all aid instead of just the grants or scholarships when trying to understand the difference in the cost. Loan eligibility is going to be there at all of the different schools. And to the extent the parents are able or willing to borrow a federal parent loan, that's going to be available as well. But do the calculation before you get into the loans to understand what's that bottom line that the family has to come up with, whether it's through cash we're paying right up front, or it's a payment plan, or it's some type of borrowing. And that way then you can assess how much am I going to have to borrow, for example, or pay out of pocket. You've got that total dollar amount that the family has to come up with when comparing the cost of the different schools. Any questions about financial aid offers before we go to the next topic?
I don't have any questions in the chat currently. I do know that, as we get to closer to 3:30, people might have to drop off.
Okay.
And that's okay. We are recording this session for everyone. I think I put in the chat earlier where we will post the recording, and also we will post the PowerPoint there. We've had several requests for your amazing PowerPoint, Jeff.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you.
So yes, if you guys have to leave early, it's fine. We'll keep on plugging away. And those will be posted on our webinar page of our Minnesota website. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Beth. This next section is much shorter. In terms of options and responsibilities, it's really important just to understand who has responsibility and understand different types of loan and billing options. This particular slide is provided by the U.S. Department of Education, and you can see the URL there from studentaid.gov, and talks about different situations that might affect financial aid eligibility. This next slide has to do with who's responsible, and we see a transition. Frequently when students are in high school, parents may be taking the lead in understanding these costs, but definitely by the time the student is in college, from the perspective of the college or university, the student needs to understand how much college costs. The student needs to have a plan in knowing how they're going to pay for school and understand the resources. And so the encouragement of working with parents is to bring them into the loop and help them to help their student understand the costs. Because even if the parents are helping pay the school bill, at the end of the day, it's the student who's obligated to repay that bill at the college or university. Different kinds of loans. There's loans the student can borrow. There are loans that the parent can borrow. There's private loans for parents. There's private loans for students. And it's important, even if the school only offers you eligibility for the federal loans, like the federal subsidized, unsubsidized, or federal parent loan, if the parents are going down the path of a federal parent loan, I would encourage them to check out some other options. At a school like Bethel, we talk about parent or private loan eligibility, and there's resources available online because frankly, again, with the parents who have good credit, if they're going to borrow, oftentimes they can get an educational loan where the terms are more favorable than the federal parent loan. College billing, when and how to pay. It's really common that students are going to pay their fall bill at a particular point in time, At Bethel, we talk about the fall bill is due on August 15. Some schools, the fall bill might be due on September 15. And that would take care of the fall semester or the fall quarter. Spring semester, again, it's a date typically close to the beginning of spring term. At Bethel, we use January 15th is when the spring bill is due. In terms of the college billing, the details there, again, it's really important to pay attention to those, the bills. It's really common for colleges, universities to have the billing information on the portal. If a parent is involved, oftentimes they can get access to be able to view the bill. The student would have to give the parent permission. And my encouragement is if the parents are helping to pay the bill, they've got a little leverage there with the student to say, you need to at least let me see your bill or get signed up for some type of communication from the school. But it's so important for schools to monitor what's happening on their student account. In terms of book options, colleges, universities will encourage you. There are resources on our campus where you can get books. Many students will look for book options by going to an online retailer for books. It's becoming more and more common that students may not have to buy all their books because there are some low cost or no cost book options available. And the colleges, universities will make that information available to students as well. But not to be surprised, the students have to take care of their own books. They're either buying them or renting them, or they're finding them in some way. The U.S. Department of Education has done a great job in updating and summarizing step by step how do you work through the financial aid process. Studentaid.gov is where you'll see that information. And then the Office of Higher Education, I think I put the URL here. I guess I did not. But the Office of Higher Education has great resources as well in terms of additional types of financial aid options, estimating your state grant, your Pell Grant, that type of resources available on the Office of Higher Education website. My email address is there, and so if you have a particular question, go ahead and send me an email. Just identify who you are and help me know you're not the parent or of a student, and I'll do the best I can to provide some type of information for you. And that's the end of the presentation. Any other comments or questions?